Well, I would say that the difference between that schism probably isn't the right word that we're looking for here. I mean, Sunnis and Shias differ on how they interpret source material. So you can think of that as two different riffs off the same source material. And that source material is the Quran in one case and the Prophet and his example in the other. Sunnis primarily interpret this through the lens of communal unity, and they give primacy to the companions that surrounded the Prophet and as their heirs, the religious scholars today. So it's a very communal view of this material. The Shia, on the other hand, interpret this through the lens of justice, and that's a theological concept that I can talk about, but primarily they say that that authority after Muhammad rested in his family and in a particular line of his family. So it's very much of a family-centric, the Prophet's family-centric view of the same source material. So they're both viable interpretations of the same source material, but they're just slightly different, and that difference plays itself out theologically over time as something quite different over time. So the other thing I would say is that the primary misconception is a misconception that you hear in the media all the time, which is that Sunnis and Shias, A, have been fighting each other forever, and B, that the schism began when the Prophet died. Because these two interpretations only emerged hundreds of years after Muhammad. But today we have this image in our minds that the Prophet dies and then one group goes here, one group goes here, and they've been killing each other ever since, which I think is probably the most important misconception regarding these two communities. So, I mean, I spoke a little bit about justice, but another thing we can think about, well, what we mean when we say justice, is a theological notion of justice. So the Shia believe that God is just in a way that human beings can understand. And that's not an Islamic thing. I mean, all religious traditions discuss what does it mean for God to be a just God. Does it mean that we shouldn't have natural disasters? Why does murder happen? What about evil? Do we have free will? All of these things flow from this idea. Well, the Shia firmly rest on the position that God is just in a way that we can understand. So that's one thing. Theologically, that's what really makes the Shia distinct. I guess related to that is this notion of imamate, and you hear a lot the word imam, and it can mean lots of different things. But in the Shi'i context, the imam represents the legitimate political and religious leadership of the community. So the Shia believe very strongly that the imam figure has to be a descendant of Muhammad through the only daughter who had children, Fatima, and his cousin Ali. And so this community of descendants of the Prophet are where political and religious authority rests. So those two things, this notion of justice of God as being understandable, and this notion that political and religious leadership is vested in the descendants of the Prophet, in this institution called the Imam, are probably the key theological tenets that at least unite all the Shias. One of the big misconceptions is that there are only one kind of Shia. So there are many kinds of Shia. In terms of numbers, the dominant Shia community today are the Twelvers, and these are the Shia you see in Iran, in Lebanon, in most parts of the Muslim world. So they are by far the most numerous. But there are multiple types of Shia. So in Yemen, we've been hearing about this war going on in Yemen. There's a different type of Shia. They're called Zaydis, whereas some people have heard of the Aga Khan, one of the richest men in the world, and he's the head of a different Shia community, the Ismailis. So there are multiple groups of Shia. The three most important ones are the Ismailis, the Zaydis, and the Twelvers. And they differ regarding nuanced issues of who should be the Imam, how law should be articulated, and the stance that the community should have to political power. And they also differ in terms of rituals and in terms of how they remember the past. So they're quite different, and they have existed, and their differences are theological. And even to this day, we have multiple Shi'i communities, but the most, I guess, numerically important are the Twelvers. I think what you'll find is that historically Sunnis and Shias have gotten along. So again, we have this myth out there that Sunnis and Shias have always fought each other and they continue to fight each other. And many people will say we shouldn't get involved because they've been killing each other for 1400 years. But in reality, the general norm has been, if not coexistence, at least a mutual tolerance of each other. In many cases, Sunni and Shia communities have been so closely intertwined that it's even hard to separate them out. So in most cases, the default position between these two communities is one of relatively peaceful tolerance of each other. So there's nothing inherently conflict-based in the relationship between these two communities. Well, I think the first thing to bear in mind is that the kinds of tension that we have between Sunnis and Shias is very much a product of circumstance, political circumstance. So Sunnis and Shias fight against each other in cases and places where there is conflict, where there is civil war, where there is instability, where political powers are in conflict with each other. So there's nothing inherently conflict-based about the difference between Sunnis and Shias. So the first thing I want them to bear in mind is that Sunnism and Shi'ism, there's no such thing as an orthodox Sunni position and a heterodox Shi'i position. These are two equally valid, one could say, interpretations of the same source material. So I want people to understand that these are just two different readings of the same sources. And I want them to understand that there's nothing that guarantees that there must be conflict between these two communities. And for students, one of the things I want them to understand is when they hear narrative discourse that says, well, this is an ingrained, long-standing dispute that goes back to the time of Muhammad, that is a very simplified reading of the differences between Sunni and Shi'i. And I guess the final thing I would say is that on a more intellectual level, I think it would be nice for students to begin to empathize with how religious communities understand their past. So one of the themes of the book is memory. So one of the things I'm interested in showing is that we imagine and remember our past through the lens of today. So the way, for example, let's remember the Civil War is very different today than it was 100 years ago. And the same way, these communities have remembered their past through their beliefs, and their beliefs continually evolve as all religious traditions evolve. So I want them to go away from sort of a simple reification of the past, it's always been like this, to something that's a little bit more dynamic and maybe nuanced.